Well, I don't know about you, but when I think about medieval castles in winter, I used to imagine these cozy scenes. Roaring fireplaces, people feasting at long tables, maybe some snow gently falling outside those picturesque windows. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like something out of a fairy tale. Well, let me tell you a story that'll change that image pretty quickly. It's the winter of 1204, and we're in Chateau Gaillard in Normandy. This castle, by the way, was built by Richard the Lionheart himself, supposedly impregnable, the pride of English engineering, and it's under siege by the French king Philip Augustus. Now, sieges are bad enough in summer, but in winter, it's a whole different level of hell. The garrison is trapped inside. They've got maybe 6 months of food if they're careful. But here's the thing about winter in a castle during a siege. It's not the enemy that kills you first, it's the cold. The defenders are huddled around whatever fires they can maintain, rationing firewood because they don't know how long this is going to last. The stone walls that are supposed to protect them, they're basically giant refrigerators, sucking every bit of warmth out of the air. People are sleeping 3-4 to a bed just to share body heat. Their breath freezes in the air. And this is inside the castle, mind you, the so-called safe space. By the time spring came, those who survived weren't defeated by French soldiers. They were defeated by cold, by illness, by the simple fact that stone fortresses in winter are barely livable even when you're not under attack. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Not the glory of castle life, not the feasts and the tournaments. We're talking about the reality of surviving winter in a medieval castle, because trust me, it was absolutely miserable. Now, welcome to the channel, everyone. Good to have you here. Before we dive deep into frozen stone and desperate fires, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to let the people know where you're tuning in from while we talk about medieval hypothermia. But honestly, just having you here listening is support enough. If you want to share this with friends or hit the like button, great. If not, no worries. Just settle in and let's talk about cold castles.
All right, enough of that. Let's get into it. So, here's the first thing you need to understand about medieval castles, and I mean really understand. They were not built for comfort. They were built to keep people out. Everything about castle architecture prioritizes defense over literally everything else, and that creates some serious problems when you're trying to, actually live there. Think about it. Those massive stone walls, yeah, they'll stop a battering ram, they'll stop arrows, they'll stop pretty much any medieval weapon you can throw at them, but they also trap cold like you wouldn't believe. Stone has what we call thermal mass. It absorbs temperature and holds on to it. In summer, that's actually kind of nice. The stone stays cool. But in winter, oh boy. Those walls soak up the cold from outside and they just radiate it inward constantly. You could have a roaring fire in the Great Hall and the walls 20 feet away are still ice cold to the touch. And it's not like these castles were small either. We're talking about structures with halls that could be 40, 50, 60 feet high. High ceilings look impressive, sure, very grand, but hot air rises, right? So all that warmth from your fire, it's going straight up to the ceiling where nobody's standing. The people down below are basically huddling around the hearth hoping for scraps of warmth. Then you've got the windows, or, well, the lack of windows. See, windows are defensive weaknesses. Any opening in your wall is a potential entry point for attackers. So castle designers made windows as small as possible. Arrow slits, they're called. Narrow little gaps just wide enough to shoot out of, but too small for anyone to climb through. Great for defense, terrible for warmth. Because here's what happens. Even those tiny openings let in drafts, cold wind whistling through stone corridors. And there's no glass, not in most castles, not until really late in the medieval period. So you've got a choice. Leave the arrow slit open and freeze, or cover it with a wooden shutter and sit in complete darkness. Pick your poison. Oh, and speaking of defensive features, let's talk about location. Castles weren't built in nice sheltered valleys. They were built on hilltops, on cliffs, on exposed ridges where you could see enemies coming from miles away. Strategic, yes, but it also means you're catching every single gust of wind. There's no natural windbreak. The castle is the thing sticking up, getting battered by weather. I remember reading this account from a Scottish castle. I think it was Stirling, but don't quote me on that, where the wind was so constant the tapestries on the walls would billow like sails inside the castle. People would tie them down and they'd still move. That's not a gentle breeze, that's structural drafts that never stop. And the earlier castles, the Motte and Bailey types from the 11th century, those were even worse because they were made of wood, just timber on top of a dirt mound. Imagine trying to stay warm in essentially a wooden fort in the middle of winter. The wind would cut right through the planks. They'd stuff gaps with moss and mud and rags, anything to keep the wind out, but it barely helped. By the time we get to the 12th and 13th centuries, yeah, most important castles are stone, much better against attackers. But stone comes with its own problems. It's damp, especially in northern Europe where it rains constantly. England, Scotland, Wales, northern France, these places are wet, and stone doesn't just get damp, it stays damp. You'd have moisture literally running down the interior walls. In winter, that moisture would freeze into ice on the inside of your bedroom wall. There are accounts of people waking up to find their blankets stuck to the wall because moisture had frozen them in place overnight. Think about that. You're inside a building, supposedly sheltered, and it's cold enough for ice to form on the walls. The floors weren't much better, by the way, usually just stone or packed earth, sometimes with rushes or straw scattered over them for a bit of insulation, but that only does so much. Cold rises from the ground just as much as it radiates from the walls. Your feet are always cold, unless you're right next to the fire. And here's something people don't think about, the sheer size of these spaces. A great hall in a major castle could be enormous. We're talking the length of a modern basketball court, sometimes bigger. Now imagine trying to heat that with medieval technology. You've got one fireplace, maybe two if you're lucky. That's it. That's your heating system for a room that could hold 200 people. The heat doesn't distribute evenly, obviously. If you're within 10 feet of the fire, you're probably okay, maybe even warm. But venture 15, 20 feet away, you're back in the cold. So people would cluster, everyone gravitating towards the hearth like moths to a flame, because that's the only livable space in the entire room. Spiraled staircases were their own special kind of misery, these tight, winding stone stairs going up the towers. They're designed that way for defense, easy to defend from above, hard to attack going up. But they're incredibly drafty because they connect multiple floors, creating these vertical wind tunnels. Climbing up to your bedroom in a tower in winter meant walking through increasingly cold air. The higher you went, the windier it got. I read one description from a chronicler who said climbing the tower stairs in winter felt like ascending into the realm of eternal ice. Bit dramatic, maybe, but I get the point. These weren't heated staircases. They were just stone tubes full of cold air. So when we talk about castle architecture, we're talking about structures that were brilliant at keeping armies out and absolutely terrible at keeping warmth in. Every single design choice prioritized military function, and the people living there just had to adapt. Which brings us to the next question. How did people actually survive in these frozen stone fortresses?
All right, so you're a medieval person living in a castle in the middle of winter. The walls are freezing, there's ice on the inside of your window shutters, and you can see your breath indoors. What do? Well, fire. Obviously, fire. That's the only heat source they had. But it's not quite as simple as just light a fire and you're warm. Medieval heating was an art form, a constant battle, and honestly, kind of pathetic by modern standards. In the early medieval period, like the 11th and early 12th centuries, most great halls had a central hearth. Picture this, a fire pit right in the middle of the room, open on all sides, smoke rising up to a hole in the roof. That's your heating and cooking fire. Everyone gathers around it in a circle because that's the only warm spot in the entire building. The problem? Smoke. So much smoke. Yes, there's a hole in the roof for it to escape, but smoke doesn't cooperate. It billows everywhere. Your eyes are watering, you're coughing, your clothes permanently smell like wood smoke. But you stay near the fire anyway because the alternative is freezing. One account I read described a feast in a Norman castle where the smoke was so thick that servants bringing food to the table were basically navigating by memory. They couldn't see where they were going. People just accepted this. You wanted warmth? You ate smoke.
By the late 12th century, somebody finally had the bright idea, what if we put the fireplace in the wall and add a chimney? Revolutionary, right? Wall fireplaces with proper chimneys became more common in the 1200s. These were massive things, big enough to walk into sometimes. You'd have a proper stone hearth, a chimney built into the wall to draw smoke up and out. This was a huge improvement. The smoke actually left the room instead of choking everyone, and the fireplace radiated heat better than an open pit. But here's the thing. Even these impressive fireplaces could only heat so much space. A single wall fireplace might make a 30-foot radius around it tolerable. Anything beyond that? Still freezing. So, wealthier castles would have multiple fireplaces. The Great Hall gets one, maybe two. The Lord's private chamber gets its own. The Lady's solar, that's her private room, might have a smaller one. But fireplaces were expensive to build. You needed skilled masons to construct them safely, and every chimney is a weak point in your defensive walls that needs careful design. So, most rooms didn't have them. What about those rooms? Well, that's where braziers come in. A brazier is basically a metal bowl or basket on legs that holds hot coals. Portable heat. You'd take coals from the main fire, put them in your brazier, and carry warmth to wherever you needed it. Your bedroom, a storage room you're working in, wherever. Braziers were essential, but they were also incredibly dangerous. You're basically carrying an open flame around a building full of wood, cloth, and straw. Castle fires were a real problem. There are records of entire castles burning down because somebody knocked over a brazier or placed it too close to a tapestry. And braziers don't provide much heat, honestly. They're better than nothing, but you're still cold. You'd huddle over one, warm your hands, maybe warm enough to function, then move away and immediately start freezing again. So people got creative with insulation. Tapestries were huge for this. Those massive woven wall hangings you see in castle braid halls, they weren't just decoration, they were insulation. A heavy tapestry hanging on a stone wall creates an air gap between the fabric and the stone. That air gap provides a tiny bit of thermal barrier. It's not much, but it cuts down on the cold radiating from the walls. Wealthy nobles would have tapestries covering every wall they could. The more coverage, the better. Some castles even had tapestries that could be moved around. You'd hang them in the Great Hall for a feast, then take them down and hang them in the bedchamber at night to keep that room warmer. There are also records of people nailing animal skins directly to walls, fur, leather, whatever they had. One account mentions using boar hides with the fur still on, stretched over wooden frames and mounted to the stone walls. Primitive insulation, but again, every little bit helped. Floors got similar treatment. Thick carpets if you were wealthy. More commonly, you'd cover the floor in rushes, basically dried reeds and grass. You'd lay them down in thick layers, almost like a mat. They provided a tiny bit of insulation from the cold stone floor. Plus, they were softer to walk on than bare stone, which is nice when you're wearing thin leather shoes all day. The downside, rushes get disgusting. Food scraps fall into them, drinks get spilled, dogs pee on them. They'd get moldy and smelly. You are supposed to change them regularly, sweep out the old rushes and lay down fresh ones, but in winter that means exposing the bare stone floor while you're working, and nobody wants to do that when it's freezing. So sometimes the rushes would just stay there for months, getting progressively more foul. Now let's talk about beds. Medieval beds were designed with warmth in mind. The classic castle bed is a four-poster with heavy curtains on all sides. You'd climb into this bed at night and draw the curtains closed, creating a little enclosed space. Your body heat would build up inside those curtains, almost like a tent. This actually worked pretty well. Inside the curtains could be relatively cozy. Outside them, still freezing. But at least while you slept, you could be warm. The curtains were thick fabric, sometimes multiple layers. Velvet, wool, whatever you could afford. The point was to trap heat. Beds were also piled with layers, a straw mattress as the base, then maybe a feather mattress on top of that, linen sheets, wool blankets, fur coverlets. You'd sleep under this massive pile of fabric and fur. Some beds had so many layers that you practically had to climb a ladder to get in. Not even joking, there are beds with little steps because they were built so high off the ground. Part of that height was status, sure, but part was practical. Hot air rises, remember? A bed raised up on a platform is in slightly warmer air than one sitting on the cold floor. Every few inches of elevation helped. People also shared beds for warmth. This was completely normal. Servants would sleep 2 or 3 to a bed. Even nobles might share. Children definitely shared. Body heat is heat, and in a freezing castle, you weren't going to waste it by sleeping alone if you didn't have to. There's this great line I read in a household account from the 1300s where a visiting nobleman complained that he was given a private bed and he was miserably cold all night for want of a companion. He actually requested to share a bed the next night because sleeping alone was too cold. That tells you everything about castle temperatures. Clothing was another layer of defense against the cold. People wore multiple layers even indoors. A linen undergarment, a wool tunic or dress, another outer layer, maybe a cloak on top of that. Wool is amazing for insulation even when it's damp, so wool was everywhere. Hats were common indoors, hoods, caps, whatever. You lose a lot of heat through your head, and medieval people figured that out. Even nobles would wear caps inside during winter. Fashion was less important than not freezing. Gloves, too, sometimes. If you were trying to do detailed work in an unheated room, writing a letter, sewing, whatever, you might wear fingerless gloves so you could work but keep your hands from going numb. The irony is that all this effort, fireplaces, tapestries, braziers, bed curtains, multiple clothing layers, was just barely enough. On a really cold winter night, you could do everything right and still be uncomfortable. Chronicles mention nobles sitting by the fire wearing full outdoor gear, cloaks, hats, boots, because even with the fire roaring, they couldn't get warm. It's honestly kind of sad. These are some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in medieval society, and they're still shivering in their own homes. But at least they had homes that were well stocked with food, right? Well, about that.
Let's talk about eating in a medieval castle during winter, because this is where things get really interesting, and by interesting I mean difficult and kind of gross. First, the obvious problem. There's no refrigeration. Well, actually there is refrigeration. The whole castle is basically a refrigerator, but that's not controlled refrigeration. That's just cold. And cold without proper food storage methods leads to some serious problems. So how do you feed potentially hundreds of people, a noble household, servants, guards, visitors, through an entire winter when nothing's growing and you can't exactly run to the market? Preservation. Everything revolves around preserving food during autumn so you can eat it during winter. And medieval people got very, very good at this. Salting was the big one. You could salt meat and it would last months. Beef, pork, mutton, even fish, packed in salt, stored in barrels. The salt draws out moisture and prevents decay. Works great. Tastes terrible. Salted meat is incredibly salty, I know, shocking, and really tough. You'd have to soak it in water before cooking to make it even remotely palatable. Most winter meat dishes were some form of stew or pottage, because that was the only way to make preserved meat edible. You'd take your salt beef, soak it, then boil it for hours with whatever vegetables you had left. Onions, turnips, maybe some dried peas. Add some herbs if you had them. The result was, well, it was food. Hot food, which was the main point in winter. Smoking was another preservation method. You'd hang meat or fish in a smokehouse and let smoke from a fire slowly cure it. Smoked meat lasts pretty well and has better flavor than salted meat, but the process takes longer and you need dedicated space for it. Not every castle had proper smokehouses. Then there's drying. Dried fish was huge, especially for religious fast days when you couldn't eat meat. Stockfish, dried cod, was a staple. It's fish that's been dried so thoroughly it becomes hard as wood, not even exaggerating. You'd have to pound it with a mallet to break it down before you could cook it. But it lasts practically forever, which made it valuable. Grains were easier to store, thankfully. Wheat, barley, oats. As long as you kept them dry and away from rats, they'd last through winter no problem. Bread was the foundation of every meal. The grain would be ground into flour as needed, and bread would be baked regularly. At least that was fresh. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars.
Turnips, onions, carrots, these keep reasonably well in a cool, dark place. Medieval castles usually had storage cellars dug into the ground or built into the lower levels. These were naturally cold, which helped, but you had to check them regularly because if one vegetable started rotting, it could spread to the whole pile. Apples and pears could be stored too if you were careful, wrapped individually, laid out in a cool room. They wouldn't last all winter, but you could get a couple months out of them. Dried fruits were more reliable. Dried apples, prunes, raisins. Again, drying removes moisture and prevents spoilage. Nuts were great for winter. Walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts. They store easily, they're nutritious, and they don't require cooking. You'd have bags of nuts in the storeroom and people would just snack on them. Dairy is where things got tricky. You can't store fresh milk for long, obviously, but cheese? Cheese lasts. Hard cheeses can keep for months or even years, so cheese was a major protein source in winter. Different regions had their own cheese-making traditions, and a well-stocked castle would have varieties ranging from soft, fresh cheese to rock-hard, aged wheels. Butter could be preserved by salting it or sealing it in barrels. Again, very salty, but it worked. Now here's where castle life had an advantage over peasant life. Castles usually had hunting parks. Nobles had the legal right to hunt deer, boar, and other game in their forests. In winter, when preserved food was getting monotonous, a hunting party could bring back fresh venison. That was a huge morale boost. But hunting in winter was difficult and dangerous. Snow, freezing temperatures, shorter daylight hours. Sometimes the deer were scarce because they'd moved to better feeding grounds, so you couldn't count on fresh game. It was a bonus when you got it, not a reliable food source. Wealthy castles also had fish ponds. These were artificial ponds stocked with fish, carp, pike, eels. You could fish from your own pond year-round, even in winter if it didn't freeze solid. Fresh fish was another welcome break from salted everything. Cooking methods in winter were pretty much the same as summer, but with some adaptations. The kitchen fire was kept going constantly because it provided heat as well as cooking capability. Kitchens were usually the warmest rooms in the castle, which made them popular gathering spots for servants. Most winter cooking was boiling or roasting. Stews, obviously, but also roasted meats when they had fresh game. The great hall fireplace was big enough to roast whole animals, a deer, a pig. They'd put it on a spit and turn it over the fire for hours. The smell would fill the hall, which was probably a nice change from the usual odor of damp stone and smoke. Spices were super important in winter cooking, more than usual, partly because preserved food is bland and needs flavor, but also because spices were believed to have warming properties. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, these were thought to heat the body from within. Whether that's actually true or not, they definitely made food taste better. One thing people don't realize, medieval people drank a lot. Not just socially, but as a baseline. Water was often unsafe, especially standing water in winter. Beer and ale were safer because the brewing process killed bacteria, so everyone drank ale daily. Weak ale, not super alcoholic, but constant. Wine for the wealthy, of course. Wine stores well and doesn't freeze easily, which made it good for winter. You'd drink it warmed, sometimes with spices added. Mulled wine was a thing, and it served a practical purpose. It was warm liquid going into your cold body. Hot drinks in general were valued in winter. Even just hot water with honey was considered a treat. Anything warm was good. Meal timing followed daylight hours. Breakfast was light, maybe just bread and ale. The main meal was midday, while there was still good light. Supper in the evening was smaller, partly because you didn't want to be working in the kitchen late at night when it was dark and cold. But here's the reality check. Even with all these preservation methods, food quality declined as winter went on. By late winter, early spring, what they called the hungry gap, you're down to the dregs of your supplies. The best stuff had been eaten months ago. Now you're eating the oldest, most preserved, least appealing food. Salted meat that's been in a barrel for 5 months, grain that tastes stale, vegetables that are starting to soften and sprout. This is when food shortages hit hardest because spring planting hasn't happened yet and winter stores are almost gone. Some winters were worse than others. A bad harvest in autumn meant limited supplies. Unexpected guests or a larger garrison meant food ran out faster. There are accounts of castle households rationing food in late winter, cutting portions to make supplies last until spring. And if you were under siege, forget it. Food became the most critical resource. We'll get to siege conditions later, but just know that food scarcity could turn a well-stocked castle into a starving garrison in a matter of weeks. But assuming you had food and you were reasonably warm, or at least not actively freezing, there's still the matter of daily life. How did people actually spend their time in winter? What were the routines?
You know what's interesting about medieval clothing? We tend to think of it as fashion, as status symbols, the rich nobles and their fancy tunics and gowns. But in winter, clothing wasn't about fashion, it was survival equipment. Portable insulation that you wore every single day. Let's start with the basics. Linen undergarments. Everyone wore these, from peasants to kings. A linen shirt or shift directly against your skin. Now you might think, linen? That's a summer fabric, light and breathable. Why would you wear that in winter? Here's why. Linen absorbs sweat. In winter, if you're wearing heavy wool layers, you're going to sweat when you're near a fire or doing any physical work. That sweat needs to go somewhere. If it stays against your wool clothing, the wool gets damp, and damp wool loses its insulating properties. But if you have a linen layer between your skin and your wool, the linen absorbs the moisture and the wool stays dry. Plus, linen could be washed regularly. You'd change your linen shirt every few days, boil it clean, and put on a fresh one. The wool outer layers, those got washed maybe once a season, if that. So the linen also acted as a barrier, keeping your body oils and dirt away from the expensive wool garments. Over the linen, you'd wear wool. Wool everything. A wool tunic for men, a wool gown for women, wool hose, basically leggings. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval world. It insulates even when wet. It's durable. It's relatively affordable if you're anywhere near sheep farming regions. But not all wool is the same. Coarse wool was scratchy and rough. Fine wool, especially from certain breeds of sheep or imported from places like Spain, was softer and warmer. Wealthy people wore fine wool. Poor people wore whatever they could get. The tunic or gown wasn't skin tight, it was loose, which actually helped with warmth because it trapped air. Air is an insulator. A loose wool tunic with a linen shirt underneath created layers of trapped air that kept you warmer than a single tight garment would. Then you'd add more layers, a surcoat, an outer garment that went over your tunic, maybe sleeveless, maybe with sleeves. Another layer of wool, another layer of trapped air. And then a cloak. Oh man, cloaks were essential. A heavy wool cloak, ideally lined with fur if you could afford it. You'd wrap this around yourself like a blanket. Nobles had clasps and brooches to hold their cloaks closed. Poorer folk might just tie theirs with a cord. Fur was the ultimate status symbol and the ultimate insulation. Ermine, mink, sable for the wealthy. Rabbit, squirrel, sheepskin for everyone else. Fur-lined cloaks, fur-trimmed hoods, fur-lined gloves. If you could afford to basically wrap yourself in dead animals, you did. Hoods were huge in winter. A hood kept your head and neck warm, which made a massive difference in overall body warmth. Some hoods were separate pieces you'd tie on, others were attached to your cloak. Either way, you wore a hood indoors if it was cold enough. Hats, too. Wool caps, felt caps, whatever you had. Covering your head was non-negotiable in winter. Hands were tricky because you needed to use them for tasks. Thick gloves kept you warm but made delicate work impossible, so fingerless gloves were common. They covered your palms and wrists but left your fingers free. You'd alternate between warming your hands and using them, constantly trying to balance function and warmth. Feet were always a problem. Leather shoes or boots were standard, but leather isn't warm. People would stuff their shoes with straw or wool for extra insulation. Wool socks helped. Some people wrapped their feet in cloth before putting on shoes, creating extra layers. Wooden pattens, basically wooden platforms that strapped to the bottom of your shoes, kept your feet up out of mud and snow when you went outside, but they were clunky and hard to walk in. Here's something that might surprise you. People often slept in their clothes, or at least some of their clothes. You might remove your outer cloak and your shoes, but keep your tunic and hose on when you got into bed. The bed would warm you up eventually, but until it did, those clothing layers helped. Changing clothes was a bigger production in winter because you had to undress in a cold room, so people did it less frequently.
You'd wear the same tunic for days or even weeks, just changing the linen shirt underneath. The linen got washed, the wool just got aired out. Laundry in winter was miserable work. You had to haul water, heat it over a fire, scrub clothes by hand in tubs, then hang them to dry. In a damp, cold castle, clothes could take days to dry, so laundry happened less often and you needed more sets of clothing to rotate through. Wealthy households had dedicated laundry servants whose job was just washing clothes. They'd use harsh lye soap, made from wood ash and fat, to scrub out stains. They'd beat the clothes against rocks or washboards. Hard labor. For stain removal, they used whatever worked. Urine was common. The ammonia helps break down stains. Also vinegar, chalk, various plant juices. Medieval laundry techniques were surprisingly effective, just very labor-intensive. Clothing repairs were constant. Wool would get holes from moths or just from wear. These would be patched and mended rather than replacing the whole garment. Sewing was a skill everyone had at some level because you couldn't afford to throw away damaged clothing. There were also certain garments specifically for winter. Heavier cloaks, thicker hoods, extra layers. Wealthy people had seasonal wardrobes, summer clothes and winter clothes. They'd pack away the light linen tunics in autumn and bring out the heavy wool. Speaking of moths, they were the enemy of winter clothing. Moths love wool. A single moth infestation could destroy your entire winter wardrobe. So people used cedar chests for storage. Cedar naturally repels moths. They'd also put lavender, wormwood, or other aromatic herbs among stored clothes to keep insects away. And remember that weird thing I mentioned earlier about guard robes, the castle toilets? One theory for why they're called wardrobe is that people would actually hang their nice clothes near the privy because the smell kept moths and fleas away. Whether that's true or just a folk etymology, I don't know, but it tells you something about priorities. Better smelly clothes than moth-eaten ones. The whole textile industry in castles was geared towards winter survival. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing garments, repairing damage. This was year-round work, but it was absolutely critical for making it through winter. Women in the castle household spent hours every day on textile work, spinning with a drop spindle or spinning wheel, weaving on looms, embroidering, sewing. This wasn't just decorative, this was producing the clothing and linens that kept everyone alive. Even men did some of this work. Tailoring was a male profession. Embroidery could be done by either gender among the wealthy. It was seen as a refined skill. The point is, clothing wasn't something you bought and forgot about. It was a constant project, maintaining and creating the layers that stood between you and the cold. And all these layers, all this work, was just to make daily life bearable. Which brings us to the actual rhythms of castle life in winter. How did people structure their days?
Medieval people in winter lived by the sun. They had to. When your only light sources are daylight, candles, and torches, you adjust your entire schedule around when it's naturally bright outside. Winter days in Northern Europe are short, really short. In December in England or Northern France, you might have only 8 hours of daylight. Sunrise around 8 a.m., sunset around 4 p.m. That's your working day right there. So people woke at dawn. Not by choice, really. It's just that once the sun's up, it's easier to be awake and active than to lie in a dark, cold room. You'd hear the church bells ringing for morning prayers. Every castle had a chapel, and the bells marked the hours of prayer throughout the day. The first task was usually rekindling fires. The great hall fire would have been banked overnight, covered with ash to keep coals alive without flames. In the morning, servants would uncover those coals, add kindling, get the fire going again. This was critical because that fire was your heat source for the day. Same thing in any rooms with fireplaces or braziers. Get the fires going first thing. While that was happening, people would deal with personal necessities, visiting the garderobe, which in winter was absolutely miserable. Stone seat, freezing cold, wind whistling up the shaft. You did your business as quickly as possible and got out. Washing up was minimal in winter. You'd pour some water from a pitcher into a basin, and that water was probably close to freezing. Splash your face and hands, dry off. Full bathing? Not happening. Maybe once a week if you were dedicated, more likely once a month. Getting dressed meant adding layers. Linen shirt, wool tunic,
Another layer, cloak, hood. By the time you were fully dressed, you felt like you could barely move, but you needed all of it. Breakfast was light. Bread, maybe some cheese, ale. You'd eat near the fire if you could. The Great Hall would have people filtering in, everyone trying to get warm before starting their day's work. Morning was for important tasks that required good light. If you were a clerk doing accounting, you'd work in the morning while you could see the parchment clearly. If you were sewing or doing detailed craft work, morning was your time. The lord of the castle might hold court in the morning, dealing with administrative matters, hearing petitions from tenants, that sort of thing. This would happen in the Great Hall, near the fire. Guards did their rotations regardless of weather. Being on watch in winter was brutal. Standing on a frozen wall walk, wind cutting through you, trying to stay alert. Guards would rotate frequently, maybe 2-hour shifts instead of 4-hour, because longer than that and you risked frostbite or hypothermia. Kitchen work happened all morning, preparing the midday meal, which was the main meal of the day. This was a big production, especially if there were lots of people to feed. Multiple courses for the noble table, simpler fare for servants and guards. The kitchen was one of the best places to be in winter because it was warm. There was always a fire going for cooking, often multiple fires, steam from boiling pots, heat from ovens if they were baking bread. Servants would volunteer for kitchen duty in winter just to stay warm. Midday meal was when everyone gathered in the Great Hall. This was the social center of castle life. The lord and lady at the high table, everyone else at trestle tables arranged down the hall. Hot food, maybe some entertainment if there was a traveling minstrel or a juggler. Meals were communal and hierarchical. The best food went to the high table, leftovers and simpler dishes for everyone else. But at least it was warm food, and everyone was together in one heated space. After the meal, the afternoon was for whatever work needed doing. But this is where winter created problems. By 2 or 3 p.m., the light was already starting to fade. Tasks that required good visibility had to be rushed or postponed. Outdoor work was limited to the middle of the day when it was warmest. Repairs to buildings, tending to animals in the courtyard, anything that had to be done outside got squeezed into that narrow window. As the sun set, people retreated indoors. There just wasn't much point being outside in the dark and cold. The Great Hall would fill up again. This was when social activities happened. Music, storytelling, games like chess or dice. People would do handwork by firelight, mending clothes, whittling, simple tasks that didn't require perfect vision. Women would spin thread or do embroidery in groups, talking while they worked. Supper was lighter than the midday meal, maybe just bread and leftovers, some ale. You didn't want to do heavy cooking late in the day when you were working by candlelight. Even evenings were for staying warm and entertained until bedtime. If the lord could afford it, there might be a fire in the Great Hall all evening. People would cluster around it, telling stories, singing songs. This is how oral traditions got passed down. Long winter nights with nothing to do but talk. Entertainment was valued in winter more than summer because you were stuck indoors so much. A good storyteller, a musician, even someone who could juggle or do tricks, these people were welcome guests because they broke the monotony. Religious observance was also more intensive in winter. More time for prayer, more participation in church services. Partly because what else are you going to do? And partly because when life is hard, people turn to religion for comfort. Bedtime came early. By modern standards, ridiculously early. People would go to bed around 8 or 9 p.m., sometimes earlier. Why stay up? Candles and lamp oil were expensive. The hall was getting cold as the fire died down. Better to get in bed where you could be warm. Beds, as I mentioned before, were warm once you got them heated up with body heat. Drawing those curtains closed created a little warm pod. You'd pile under furs and blankets and actually be comfortable for the first time all day. But sleep was often interrupted. You'd wake up cold in the middle of the night because the bed had cooled down, or you'd need to pee, which meant either using a chamber pot in your freezing room or making a trip to the garderobe. Either option was miserable. Some people would wake multiple times during the night. There's actually historical evidence that before modern times, people had segmented sleep. First sleep, then a period of wakefulness, then second sleep. During that wakeful period in the middle of the night, you might lie in bed thinking, praying, talking to your bedmate if you had one. When morning came around again, the whole cycle repeated. And it repeated for months, November, December, January, February, into March. Winter felt endless because every day was the same struggle against cold and darkness. This routine was grinding. It wore people down. Chronicles mention winter sickness, a melancholy that would settle over people during the darkest months. We'd probably call it seasonal affective disorder today, but medieval people noticed it too, this psychological weight of winter. And this was normal times. This was when everything was going okay. But what happened when things went wrong? What if you were under attack?
Let's talk about the absolute worst-case scenario. Your castle under siege in the middle of winter. A siege is bad enough in summer, but in winter, it's a special kind of hell. Because now you're not just fighting an enemy army outside your walls, you're fighting cold, you're fighting dwindling supplies, you're fighting disease, and you're fighting the psychological pressure of being trapped in a freezing stone box with hundreds of other terrified, hungry people. I want to paint you a picture. It's January. Let's say it's the year 1216, during the First Barons' War in England. Your castle has been surrounded by enemy forces. They showed up 2 weeks ago and they're not leaving. They've built siege camps around your walls. You can see their tents, their fires. They're warm. They can get supplies. You can't. The first thing that happens is rationing. Your castle steward takes stock of everything in the storerooms and does the math. How many people inside the castle? How much food? How long can we last? Maybe you've got 3 months of food if you're careful, maybe less. So portions get cut immediately. The bread ration gets smaller, the ale gets watered down, meat becomes a luxury reserved for the garrison fighters. And you can't supplement with hunting or fishing anymore because you can't leave the castle. Those deer in the forest, the enemy's eating them. Your fish ponds, if they're outside the walls, you can't access them. So you're stuck with what you had when the siege started, and it's going to run out eventually. Firewood becomes critical. You need fires for warmth and cooking, but you've got a finite amount of wood. Do you heat the Great Hall and keep everyone together, or do you try to maintain fires in multiple rooms? Do you keep fires going at night, or do you bank them and freeze? These are life or death decisions. If you run out of firewood before the siege ends, people will freeze. So you start burning furniture, chairs, tables, anything wooden that's not structural. There are records of besieged castles where they burned the doors off bedrooms just to keep the hall fire going. Water is another huge problem. Most castles had wells, which is good, but wells can be sabotaged. If the enemy has access to your water source outside the walls, they might poison it or divert it. Some sieges ended because the castle's water ran out. Even if your well is secure, you've got hundreds of people using that water, drinking it, cooking with it, trying to stay clean. The well gets contaminated. Buckets fall in, waste seeps in, the water starts making people sick. Sanitation breaks down fast in a siege. Remember those garderobes that emptied outside the walls? Now you can't use them safely because the enemy is camped right there. They might shoot arrows at anyone using the privy. Sounds ridiculous, but it happened. You're sitting there doing your business and an arrow comes through the opening. So people start using chamber pots and buckets indoors. But where do you empty them? You can't go outside. Some castles had internal cesspits, but those fill up fast when you've got hundreds of people. The smell becomes unbearable. Imagine a castle great hall in winter. Already cold and damp, now add the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, smoke from fires. People are packed together because there's safety in numbers and it's warmer, but the air is foul. Disease spreads like wildfire in these conditions. Dysentery, typhoid fever, pneumonia. One person gets sick, they infect 10 others. You've got no antibiotics, limited medical knowledge, people die, and you can't even bury them properly because the graveyard's outside the walls. Bodies get dumped over the walls or stored in cold parts of the castle until the siege ends, which is horrific for morale. You're living with corpses. The psychological pressure is intense.
Every day you wake up wondering if today's the day the enemy breaks through. You hear them outside, the sound of siege engines being built, battering rams hitting your gates, men shouting. It never stops. At night, it's worse because you can't see what's happening. Every noise could be an attack. Sleep is impossible. Even when you're exhausted, you're too afraid to actually rest. Children crying because they're hungry and scared, adults arguing about strategy, about whether to surrender, about rationing, fights breaking out over food or space near the fire. The social order starts breaking down because people are desperate. And the cold is relentless. You can't leave to warm up. You can't take a walk to clear your head. You're just stuck in these stone rooms, getting colder and hungrier and more frightened every day. Now, defenders did fight back during sieges. Archers would shoot at the enemy from the walls, you'd pour boiling water or hot sand on people trying to scale the walls, you'd send out raiding parties at night to damage siege equipment. But in winter, that's even harder. Bowstrings freeze and snap. Your fingers are too numb to draw a bow properly. Soldiers on the walls are fighting frostbite as much as they're fighting enemies. There's a famous account from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, slightly before our period, but relevant. The defenders lasted for weeks in autumn, but by the time the castle fell, the survivors were described as more dead than alive, emaciated, sick, barely able to walk. And that's when a siege ends relatively quickly. Some sieges lasted months. The siege of Chateau Gaillard that I mentioned at the start, that went from September to March, 6 months. By the end, the defenders were eating horses, then dogs, then rats. There's a particularly grim detail from that siege. The garrison expelled the civilians, women, children, old people, hoping the attackers would let them through. But the French king refused. He wanted them to drain the castle's food supply. So these people were trapped between the castle walls and the siege lines, hundreds of them. They slowly starved in no man's land while both sides watched. That's the reality of medieval siege warfare. It's not romantic. It's not glorious. It's civilians dying of starvation and cold while soldiers on both sides do the math on how long the food will last. From inside the castle during a winter siege, every day is a negotiation between death by starvation, death by disease, death by cold, or death by the enemy if you surrender and they decide to massacre you. Sometimes surrender was the smart choice. Negotiate terms, hand over the castle, hope for mercy. But sometimes the besieging army wouldn't accept surrender. They wanted to make an example. So you held out and hoped for relief forces that might never come. The psychological effect of sieges lasted long after the actual event. People who survived castle sieges often had what we'd probably diagnose as PTSD. Chronicles mention survivors who couldn't sleep in enclosed spaces afterward, who hoarded food even when it was plentiful, who startled at loud noises. One account I read described a lady who survived a winter siege and afterward refused to ever live in a castle again. She'd only stay in manor houses with easy exits. The trauma was that severe. And here's the thing, this wasn't rare. Medieval castles were frequently besieged. If you lived in a castle in a contested region, you might experience a siege multiple times in your life. It was an ever-present possibility. Even when there wasn't an active siege, the threat was there. You knew it could happen, and that fear colored everything about castle life. You maintained those massive walls and stockpiled food not just in case, but in expectation that eventually someone would attack. So when we talk about why castle life was miserable, the constant possibility of siege has to be part of that conversation, because even on a good day, you knew that tomorrow might bring an army to your gates. But let's step back from that nightmare scenario and look at the broader picture. What was it actually like to live this way for months on end?
I want to talk about something that doesn't get mentioned much in medieval history: the psychological weight of castle life in winter. Because it's one thing to be physically uncomfortable, it's another thing to be psychologically ground down by months of cold, darkness, and isolation. Think about what winter in a castle actually meant for your mental state. You wake up in darkness, you go to bed in darkness. The few hours of daylight you get are often overcast because it's winter in northern Europe. Gray sky, gray stone walls, dim firelight. For months. We know now that humans need sunlight. Vitamin D, circadian rhythms, all of that.
Medieval people didn't know the science, but they felt the effects. That winter sickness I mentioned earlier, the melancholy that would settle over people, that was real. You're also trapped. Not in a siege scenario necessarily, but just by weather. Heavy snow could make roads impassable for weeks. You couldn't leave the castle even if you wanted to. You were stuck with the same people in the same rooms having the same conversations, day after day. For women especially, this could be suffocating. Noble women had very limited freedom anyway, but winter made it worse. You couldn't go riding, you couldn't walk in the gardens, you were confined to the women's quarters, the solar or the ladies' chambers, doing embroidery and textile work with the same handful of women for months. We have letters from medieval noblewomen complaining about this. One letter from the 13th century describes a young bride who was near mad with loneliness after being married and sent to her husband's castle in Scotland. She'd grown up in southern England, and the Scottish winter in a remote castle was so isolating that she begged her family to visit. Men had it slightly better because they had outdoor duties, hunting when possible, overseeing estate business, military training, but they were still confined compared to summer. A lord who'd normally travel between his various estates might be stuck in one castle all winter. The lack of privacy compounded everything. You couldn't get away from people. You were constantly surrounded, constantly observed. If you were upset or frustrated, you couldn't just go for a walk to clear your head. You'd have to go to your cold bedroom and sit there, or stay in the crowded hall with everyone else. Arguments and tensions that would blow over quickly in summer could fester in winter because there was no escape. Servants who didn't get along had to work together daily. Family members who annoyed each other couldn't create distance. Everyone was on top of everyone else. And the boredom. God, the boredom. Entertainment was limited. Books were rare and expensive. Most people couldn't read anyway. So you had music, storytelling, games, and that was about it. Same songs, same stories, same games, night after night. Wealthy castles might have a resident minstrel or bring in entertainers, but even that got repetitive. There's only so many times you can hear the same lute player before you want to throw something. People would drink more in winter, partly for warmth, but partly just to cope. Alcohol was a way to pass time, to dull the discomfort, to make the evenings more bearable. Chronicles mention winter feasts where people drank themselves into stupors just because what else was there to do? Religious observance increased in winter too, and I think some of that was psychological. Prayer gave structure to the day. Saints' days and church festivals broke up the monotony, and the promise of heaven was comforting when your earthly existence was so miserable. There's also this constant undercurrent of danger and uncertainty. You're cold, but at least you're not freezing to death. You're hungry, but at least you have food. You're safe behind these walls, but what if an army shows up? What if the food runs out? What if someone gets sick? Medieval people lived with a level of uncertainty that's hard for us to imagine. No weather forecasts, no insurance, no emergency services. If something went wrong, you dealt with it or you died. That stress accumulates. And for the castle garrison, the soldiers stationed there, winter was a test of endurance. You're doing watch duty on frozen walls, you're training in cold courtyards, you're ready for attack that might never come. The waiting is exhausting. Morale was a constant concern. A castle garrison with low morale was useless, so lords tried to keep spirits up with entertainment, good food when possible, rewards for service. But in a long, hard winter, morale inevitably declined. There are records of castle mutinies in winter. Soldiers who decided they'd had enough, demanded back pay or better conditions, and sometimes just left. Desertion was a problem, because when you're cold and miserable and haven't been paid in months, loyalty to your lord starts feeling less important than survival. For the castle staff, servants, cooks, craftspeople, winter was just grinding labor. Your work didn't stop because it was cold. Fires still needed tending, food still needed cooking, clothes still needed washing. Except now everything was harder because the water's freezing and your hands are numb and the workspace is dark. Accidents increased in winter. Slipping on ice, falling on stairs, cutting yourself because your hands were too cold to work properly. Minor injuries that would be inconvenient in summer could be serious in winter because healing was slower and infection was more likely. The cumulative effect of all this, the cold, the darkness, the confinement, the boredom, the stress, wore people down. By late winter, everyone was irritable and exhausted. That's why spring was celebrated so intensely. The return of warmth and light wasn't just pleasant, it was salvation. Medieval people were tough, no question. They endured things we can't imagine enduring, but they weren't superhuman. They felt the same psychological pressures we would. They got depressed, anxious, claustrophobic. They just didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it that way. And they developed coping mechanisms. Community became incredibly important. Shared suffering created bonds. The people you spent a winter in a castle with, you'd remember them. You'd survived something together. Humor helped too. Medieval people could be surprisingly funny even in hard times. Jokes, pranks, satire, these were ways to cope with misery. If you can laugh at your situation, it's a bit more bearable. Hope helped too. The knowledge that spring would come eventually, that winter wasn't forever. Feast days on the calendar gave you something to look forward to. Christmas, Candlemas, St. Valentine's Day, these markers broke winter into manageable chunks. But ultimately, castle life in winter was about endurance. You endured the cold, the darkness, the confinement, the boredom, the fear. You made it through one day, then another, and eventually the snow melted and life got easier again. Until next winter.
So there you have it, the reality of medieval castle life in winter. Not exactly the romantic image from movies, is it? We've covered a lot of ground here. The architecture that trapped cold inside those stone walls. The desperate attempts at heating with fireplaces and braziers and layers of clothing. The food preservation and the dwindling supplies as winter dragged on. The daily routines dictated by short daylight hours. The psychological pressure of confinement and darkness. And the nightmare scenario of a winter siege. All of this to say, medieval people were incredibly tough. They had to be. They lived in conditions we'd consider uninhabitable. And they didn't just survive. They built civilizations. They created art, literature, music, architecture. They raised families, governed kingdoms, waged wars, made peace. But they did it while being cold pretty much all the time. I think there's something admirable about that resilience. These weren't people with central heating and electric lights in grocery stores. They had stone, fire, and determination, and they made it work. Of course, being tough doesn't mean they enjoyed it. Chronicles and letters from the period make it clear that people complained about the cold constantly. They hated winter. They counted the days until spring. They looked forward to moving to warmer residences. They were human, and humans generally prefer being comfortable to being miserable. The difference is they didn't have a choice. If you were a medieval noble or a castle servant, you lived where you lived and you dealt with it. There was no moving to a warmer climate. There was no upgrading to a house with better insulation. You had a castle, and castles were cold, and that was life. Over time, things did improve. By the late medieval period, the 14th and 15th centuries, castles were incorporating more comfort features, better chimneys, glazed windows, more private chambers with individual fireplaces. The worst of the cold, dark, drafty conditions started to ease. And eventually, castles became obsolete as fortifications. Gunpowder artillery made those thick stone walls less effective. So nobles started building manor houses instead, residences designed for comfort rather than defense. The age of the castle ended, and the age of the country house began. But for several centuries, the castle was where power lived, and the people in those castles paid for that power with cold feet and numb fingers and breath that frosted in the air even indoors. So next time you see a medieval castle, beautiful and imposing against a winter sky, remember what it was actually like to live there. The cold halls, the smoky fires, the darkness, the endless months of endurance. And maybe appreciate your central heating a bit more. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this long exploration of medieval winter misery. I hope you found it interesting, or at least gave you a new perspective on castle life. If you want more content like this, deep dives into the less glamorous side of history, let me know. There's plenty more to talk about. Until next time, stay warm out there, and lots of love to you all.